Hi, welcome to class today. I'm Elaine Engelhardt from Utah Valley State, and today we're going to be talking about John Stuart Mill. The class is Ethics and Values, and we've got a wonderful professor here to help us through our discussion, as well as some great students. Our professor for today is Dennis Potter. Welcome, Dennis. Glad that you could join us again.
Thanks for having me.
And I understand you like John Stuart Mill and his philosophy a lot.
Yes, I do.
Oh,
I like
good.
utilitarianism.
Well, we'll come back and discuss a little bit about the history of Mill and how he got into philosophy and some of the strong contributions he's made. But let me introduce the students first. Over here we've got Lloyd and Cassie, and on this side over here, Kisper and John. And glad to have all of you here. And I just love looking at the background of John Stuart Mill. I suppose I do, as a British philosopher. But he was basically raised by his father and homeschooled and was just brilliant. What are some of the things you've heard about his upbringing, those formative years?
Well, my understanding is that his godfather was Jeremy Bentham, who was also one of the more prominent formulators of utilitarianism, and I imagine that he kind of was raised on utilitarianism, having Jeremy Bentham as godfather.
And James Mill, his father, and Jeremy Bentham co-authored and did a lot of work in utilitarianism together.
Yeah, that's my understanding. He was also an aristocrat, which I think is important, given that his philosophy sort of is very egalitarian. It's interesting that he comes from the upper class, but yet he advocates this egalitarian philosophy.
And he was always seen as a child prodigy, a genius. What are some of the rumors that we've heard about Mill's accomplishments?
Well, I'm not sure about the details, but my understanding is that he knew Greek at a very young age. He wrote a history of the Roman Empire fairly early on in his life, like by the time he was 11 or 12 or something like that.
Can you imagine that? Yeah.
He really started doing philosophy after he had something of a nervous breakdown in his late teens, and so then he turned to doing philosophy after that.
Imagine having that kind of pressure on you from your father. And I also understand that he was meant to be a physician, that he was supposed to go into medicine, but after this breakdown said, there's nowhere I'm going but philosophy, and was truly able to refine philosophy, refine utilitarianism to the reading that we're looking at today, which comes from his small book, Utilitarianism. Yes. And any other points that you'd like to bring up about maybe some of the history behind utilitarianism?
Well, I think that both Jeremy Bentham, his godfather, and John Stuart Mill saw utilitarianism not just as an ethical theory, but actually as a program for social change. To them, philosophy wasn't any good unless it was practical, and they were trying to apply it to make changes in 19th century England, where there were lots of problems with the new development of industrialization and capitalism, and they were resistant to the inequalities that they saw in society, the injustices.
And in particular, injustices to women.
Yes.
One of the books that John Stuart Mill writes with his wife, Harriet Taylor, is called On the Subjugation of Women, and probably one of the first feminist works ever written.
Yeah, I think it is.
So a very important relationship there between he and Harriet Taylor. She was a married woman when they met, and they had a chaste relationship until her husband passed away, and then had about 7 years of marriage and kind of in their own little cocoon of love. But I think they were able to get a lot of work done together. So, well, what are some of your thoughts about John Stuart Mill, some of the things that you like about his history? Cassie, anything?
Well, I don't know. Personally, I just think that it's cool that he wrote on the subjugation of women, and as a woman, I think that that is interesting, and that he was really ahead of his time. Yeah, I appreciate that a lot.
He was.
Another reading that.
And another book of his I just love is On Liberty, and I think to be a well-educated person, both those books are musts. How about you, Lloyd?
Well, I just find it interesting, one, that he was such a genius at a young age, but two, as Dennis mentioned, that he came from an aristocrat family. I mean, when you got the wealth and everything, you almost want to keep it, but instead he was wanting to change society, and I understand he ran for political office and held office for quite a while because he wanted to try to implement his ideals into the world.
He did, and it's very much saying, let's look what's going to bring about the greatest happiness for a society, and something that was very important to the philosophy and to him.
When Dennis mentions that he wanted philosophy to be practical and applicable, and I think that's really important, and he was socially and politically active throughout his life, and he was trying to implement his philosophy, and I think that's actually what will make philosophy important, is if it can be implemented. So I like that about John Stuart Mill. Okay,
anything you'd like to add, Kisper?
I'm more acquainted with his philosophies than his history, and I do agree with a lot of his philosophies, especially the different levels of pleasures, of happiness, and I like his viewpoints on that.
Okay, very good. And Dennis, can you tell us a little bit about the Epicureans and where John Stuart Mill and perhaps Bentham fit in with the Epicureans, and then also where we have a bit of a division?
Okay, well, my understanding is that the Epicureans are, I'll use the word hedonists, although that word probably has a negative connotation in today's society. Originally, it is intended to refer to those who believe that happiness is the good, a pursuance of happiness, and the Epicureans would have advocated that we pursue happiness. I don't know that they had that they formulated this in quite the same way that the later utilitarians do. But when Jeremy Bentham comes along and writes his book on utilitarianism, which I think is called the Principles of Moral Legislation, something like that, the idea is to take this concept of happiness being the good and apply it as universally as possible, and advocate that we're doing the right thing just in case we are maximizing the amount of good for everyone who could possibly be affected by the actions that we're doing. And so they take this idea that's really an ancient idea coming from the Greeks, the idea
Sure.
that happiness is the good, and they quantify it and argue that we ought to maximize it, which is a very egalitarian approach to it.
And at times they were called the pig philosophers, you know. Well, you're just looking for pleasure, you know, what's going to bring the greatest amount of pleasure for you. And they didn't understand, the critics of the Epicureans, that actually we're looking at a higher pleasure, that we're going to develop our minds, and that we're going to go to the garden
Yes, yes.
with Epicurus and talk about the development of the mind and how this is superior to other pleasures. But in our reading today, we'll even see John Stuart Mill defending the Epicureans when he talks about the pig philosophy.
Yeah. And in fact, on that, it's important to note that when John Stuart Mill talks about happiness, when the utilitarians talk about happiness, they're talking about a sentiment, they're talking about a feeling. It's something that you could have at one moment and then not have at another moment. It's very different from, say, Aristotle's concept of happiness, which is not a feeling, but it's sort of a whole state of being, it's a whole state of the human being. But they're really focusing on feelings. They're focusing on the fact that human beings are sentient, and that morality has to do with how we deal with that aspect of human beings.
Absolutely. We don't have to run away from happiness or pleasure, but there are things that are going to make us happier and give us more pleasure, and it's a nice philosophy for developing that. So let's go ahead and pull up some of these graphics and see what they have to say. And would you read the first graphic for us, Kisper?
Yes. Morality is based on utility. In other words, the greatest happiness principle.
Okay, and let's go ahead and continue on to the next slide. And would you continue reading for us, Kisper?
Actions are right as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure.
Okay, great. So Lloyd, we've got our definition started out here on utility. Can you just put this in your own words for us?
Basically, in my own words, I'd say that utility is trying to create the greatest amount of happiness, the greatest total amount of happiness. So you're including individual levels of happiness and the total number of people who are experiencing happiness.
Okay, and from these quotes that are by John Stuart Mill, the second one in particular, Mill's starting a thesis then, and he's saying, this is where I'm starting, and this is where we're going to find happiness. And now he's going to back it up with some strong points. And let's move on to the next two graphics that talk about pleasure and how pleasures can differ. And would you read that one for us, John?
Pleasures differ in quality. Of two pleasures, if there be one to which all or almost all who have experienced of both have a decided difference, irrespective of any feeling of moral obligation to prefer it, that is the more desirable pleasure. Higher pleasures are the ones that employ the higher faculties. Now, it is an unquestionable fact that those who are equally acquainted with and equally capable of appreciating and enjoying both do give a most marked preference to the manner of existence which employs their higher faculties.
Okay, so Dennis, now we've moved on into looking at this notion of decidedly two pleasures, and that you can have a higher pleasure and a lower pleasure, and that someone who experiences them is going to have a preference. What do you think about that? Does this make sense?
Well, I think to understand what Mill is trying to get at here, we need to go a little bit back into the history of utilitarianism. Bentham advocates the greatest happiness principle as well, advocates the principle of utility, but orders pleasures in terms of quantity. If you're going to say something, if you're going to say that we have to pursue the greatest happiness, then you're going to have to order different happinesses with respect to, which ones are higher and which ones are lower. And the way Bentham orders those is entirely in terms of quantity. So how much happiness does it produce? Now that led to a criticism that it was a pig philosophy. It's just about the amount of happiness. And so Mill is responding to that, saying, no, you can order happiness, or you order these pleasures in terms of quality as well as quantity.
How about this hedonistic calculus then that Bentham had? Is it also giving a bad name to hedonism?
I don't. My view is that it's not necessarily doing that, because it just depends on what you find pleasurable and what you don't. And there's lots of things. Lots of people will disagree, I think, about what they find pleasurable. And so for someone who really enjoys to read philosophy or enjoys listening to classical music, sort of the higher aspects of society, cultured aspects of society, those people, they enjoy that, and that's what they'll rate higher than other kinds of pleasures. So it doesn't necessarily, in my view, entail that you would just engage in the more crass pleasures, from what I understand.
Very good. So even though this is on a hedonistic calculus, it certainly is not saying, well, you're a hedonist in all aspects of your life, depending on what you enjoy the most and what you enjoy the least. And it's too bad that we really don't, in this class, go into more of Bentham's theory.
Yeah. Well, Mill is interesting because of the way in which he distinguishes between quantity and quality. And he argues that, that some pleasures, although they may have the same quantity, we may experience them in the same quantity, one might have a higher quality than the other. And the way we know that is those who are acquainted with both of them perfectly would pick A over B. That means A has a higher quality over B. And I think that it makes sense to study Mill for that reason, because he draws that new distinction that wasn't present in Bentham.
Very good. And in fact, that's what we find in the quotes that we just read. And we'll continue on with this very same line of thinking. And Kisper, could you read the next ones for us as well?
A being of higher faculties requires more to make him happy, is capable probably of more acute suffering, and certainly accessible to it at more points than one of an inferior type. But in spite of these liabilities, he can never really wish to sink into what he feels to be a lower grade of existence.
Okay, thanks. Do you believe that, John? Do you know people who are beings of higher faculty and might have a little more pain in life?
Probably, but I think that he's right that these type of people are going to avoid that as much as possible. It's almost a natural inclination to just avoid sinking into a lower state. I mean, they're always going to be trying to look for more happiness and so on.
Okay. How have you often interpreted that one, Lloyd?
A lot of it, it can be interpreted a lot of ways. Sometimes I think of it as the more experiences you have, like the more you try to live your life, the more you try to learn and whatnot, you set yourself up for more disappointments sometimes. And so you can be hurt more easily. Whereas if someone who doesn't really try to exceed or try to grow and whatnot, doesn't really set themselves up, so they might be able to, the potential to get hurt might be a little less. but the potential to find greater means of happiness and whatnot are also decreased.
Very good. So Cassie here may decide that she's going to take the risk and be an English major. And it's going to be a very difficult road as she moves along with this. But are you going to be very happy if you don't continue on as an English major, Cassie?
No.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about what you require for your happiness right now that you're in college. Because you know, you could just be home eating bonbons.
Well, it's true that, you know, going to school, being an English major, you don't make a lot of money most of the time. I mean, you can teach, you can write, there's, you know, and so I would want to teach. I would like to write also, but the chances of getting a bestseller anytime soon aren't that great. So I want to teach, and that will require a lot of school. It's not the easiest way, but it's definitely more enjoyable, and I think I require learning and increasing my knowledge and my awareness of myself and, I don't know, art and the world around me for my happiness.
Okay, thank you. So Dennis, is the aristocrat being privileged here, or is he saying this is open to all of you?
I think that you could make the charge that the aristocrat is being privileged. I mean, after all, Mill was raised with all of these higher aspects of culture as just part of his everyday life. He encountered it, and of course he's going to think that classical music is better than, you know, the drinking song in the pub, right? Or to use a more contemporary example, he would think that, for example, Led Zeppelin is better than Britney Spears. So I think someone could level that charge against him and say, well, you know, you're privileging the things that you prefer, the things that bring you happiness, but for us, you know, we would rather have these other things that you would call crass. For us, that makes us happier. And it seems like that from a utilitarian point of view, given that you're supposed to be taking into account everyone's happiness, it seems like you ought to try to find out what people really prefer and not just assume that what they prefer is what you prefer.
Okay, good point. And I think we'll be getting into this as we close up the class period too. So good point. John?
When he talks about a being of higher faculties and then of an inferior type, he is talking about human beings, that one can be higher than another and so on, which is kind of opposed to Hobbes when we talked about Hobbes earlier, when he says there's equality. And Mill is almost saying that there is a superiority or a rank among human beings, and that right there might be evidence that he is privileging the aristocratic, because at the time the aristocratic were more educated and so on.
And another thing he could be doing is kind of pulling some folks up by the lapels or kicking them in the britches and saying, you know, there is more to life. And let's see what he says in the next one. This is the famous John Stuart Mill quote, and it will be on your exam. So sorry to tell you this, but he's well known for this. And would you read this one for us, Cassie?
Sure. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool dissatisfied. And if the fool or the pig is of a different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides.
Wow, so here we've got the pig going again. And tell us a little bit about this, Lloyd. How do you interpret this one?
Well, I interpret it basically saying, look, if you're smarter, if you've got more skills in thinking, you can. It takes a higher level to satisfy you. Going on with like the idea of the classical music and the bar songs and whatnot. You know, if the higher faculties you have in understanding things, the greater level of happiness you can have, or the greater level of satisfaction, which will create greater happiness. Whereas for a pig, you know, you can just be happy with rolling around in the mud and eating slop or whatever.
And how about that only one knows both sides to this comparison, John? He says, better to be a fool dissatisfied. Who knows both sides to the comparison?
Only we do. It's only the subject that really understands the situation.
I meant to say better to be Socrates,
Yeah,
dissatisfied.
better to be Socrates. So if you are Socrates and you have more intelligence than the average person, then in some ways it's going to take a lot more to satisfy you.
And you're going to be the one that knows both sides to the comparison. Would it be fair, Dennis, to compliment the students and say, you're in school and you decided to take this next step and it's uncomfortable and you're taking hard tests, you're taking this hard class. Ethics and Values is a very hard class. And you're going through these challenges. And your friends who aren't in school, who have decided to, stop their education maybe right after high school, don't know both sides to the comparison. They don't know the pleasure of learning. They don't know some of your anguish that you go through as you're studying for tests, but also they don't have that knowledge that you've accumulated and acquired. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, I think it would be fair to say that Mill would prefer that everyone go through an education, that everyone have this kind of formation that we get in higher education, because society overall, from his point of view, will be better if we're given that kind of education. In fact, he was a big advocate of allowing the same kind of education that he had as an aristocratic, child. He was a big advocate of universalizing that, so that way everyone would be able to pick between both. And he was very, very confident that once everyone had that education, everyone really would pick what he picks, namely classical music and so on.
In fact, that's what we find with most of our philosophers. The ideal philosophy is mine. It's the one that, that I'm giving you right here, and you'll come around to it. And for him, it's quite decided. He's going to say it's better to be a human being dissatisfied. He wants you to be dissatisfied. He wants you to want more. He wants you to understand more, and that there's a better life than being a pig. Yeah, but
notice though, he's not elitist in the way that he says there's just some people that are better than others.
No, he doesn't
that's
do
just
that.
a matter of accident of birth, and he recognizes that, and he wants everyone to have the same opportunities that he's had, and once they do, then they'll recognize the higher pleasures.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's go ahead. Oh, Lloyd, go ahead.
Yeah, this is kind of going back a little bit. It's a question I've had on my mind for the last few minutes. When they're discussing the difference between happiness and unhappiness, and talking about the sum total of happiness, the greatest amount of happiness, is unhappiness considered like a negation of happiness, or is it just considered not counted at all? So, like if you have to choose between making 5 people happy and 4 people sad, or making 4 people happy and no one sad, or something like that.
That's a good question.
I think it is too. Go ahead.
I was going to say it. I think that. Unhappiness is clearly both the privation of pleasure and the presence of pain. Either of those can be unhappiness, according to his definition. The question is, how do you rate those together? And I think that that's a really good question, because utilitarianism is supposed to be a moral theory that involves a calculus, and you're supposed to be able to rank those, and he doesn't specify exactly how to rank those and how to quantify those, how to order them, and so that's a really good question to ask. I think that one way that contemporary utilitarians have responded to that is just ask people: would you rather lack pain entirely, not have any pain but also not have any happiness, or would you rather have some pain sometimes but then have some pleasure that goes along with it, and find out how do they feel about this experience, and how do they feel about this experience, and if the vast majority of people prefer one over the other, then act so as to maximize that one rather than the other. This is sometimes called preference utilitarianism.
Very good, very thorough answer. And my answer might be just a little bit more simple, which would say that he's saying, yes, you do need to look at those that would bring about a greater pleasure for others, and that you may have to make some sacrifices. But as we read on, you'll also see where he says, don't make any useless self-sacrifices. So maybe if something does not bring you a pleasure, but you can see it's decidedly a pleasure for the majority, that you'll have to step back. Also, a criticism that we can talk about later on in the class is, so who gets to decide, who gets to privilege this particular position? So it becomes quite interesting. Well, let's pull up the next graphic. And Lloyd, would you read this one for us?
Sure. The utilitarian morality does recognize in human beings the power of sacrificing their greatest good for the good of others. It only refuses to admit that the sacrifice is itself a good. A sacrifice which does not increase or tend to increase the sum total of happiness it considers as wasted.
Okay, thanks. So just the point that I was making there. And John, do you want to tell us a little bit about a sacrifice, if you have to sacrifice?
Well, it's like Cassie was talking about earlier. I mean, if she's in school, school is kind of a sacrifice for a greater reward. And if she gets her PhD in English and she's able to be a professor at a college, you know, there was a sacrifice involved to get to that point where she could get her PhD and actually be happy with that. So.
Okay, very good. Now, Dennis, let's say, I think it's a great point, and let's even make it more heinous. And let's say that someone comes running in here and they throw a bomb in the middle of the floor, and Lloyd, he is going to be our hero, and he jumps on it, and you and I say, everybody get out of here, hurry, 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 and after about 5 minutes, the bomb blows up with Lloyd. Or we could have the example of, you know, the bomb comes in and, you know, we all decide we're going to take a calculated guess and leave. But what would Mill say about our Lloyd's sacrifice here?
Well, obviously, if it took 5 minutes for it to blow up, then it was a needless sacrifice.
Okay.
But of course, at the time that we have to act on what we know, and at the time that the bomb came in, Lloyd might not have known. So there's a difference between what turns out to really be good and what we might know at the time. And so from a utilitarian point of view, we just have to act on whatever we know. I mean, whatever we know the likelihood of the consequence to be, we act on that. And that might demand of our lives that we do things that sacrifice our own happiness entirely. We might have to live our lives in such a way, someone might have to live her life in such a way that she sacrifices her own happiness for everyone else's.
Okay, how about Kisper, if you saw, there was a raging river, you saw a child fall into it. Would you jump in and try to save that child?
Well, I think for some of us that would be our natural inclination. But according to Mill, he's saying if you're going to drown along with that child, then it's not worth it. It's a wasted self-sacrifice.
Okay, and you know if you can swim well or not. You can see that current and you know whether you can do it or not. You may feel some guilt over this, but he's going to say, you don't want a useless self-sacrifice either. So he's asking you to use your rational abilities on these sacrificing. Cassie.
So I just had a question. So we just finished with Kant, where everything was based on not your experience, but just without experience. So utilitarianism with Mill is based all on the experience that you have beforehand, or what you're guessing. I don't know. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a really good point. You could call Kant's ethical theory a rationalist ethical theory, and you could say that utilitarianism is an empiricist ethical theory because it's based on what we know will bring certain kinds of consequences.
So absolutely a consequentialist theory. And what might happen if what would Kant say, Lloyd, about you falling on the bomb and all of us getting out, even if you ended up blowing up?
Well, I think Kant would say if I didn't know whether or not when the bomb was going to go off, I think Kant would say that, for my own rational justification, I think he'd say go for it because you're doing what you would wish that would, well, maybe not because you want everyone to jump on a bomb, then everyone would die.
But you want everyone to live, don't you? Anyway, you think you ought, and you're telling everybody, run out. There's one bomb, there's one me. You run out, I'll make it so the blast isn't quite as horrendous as it could be. So.
The second form of the categorical imperative works better, the one where it says that you're supposed to treat everyone as an end and not as a means, because you're treating other persons as persons, and you're voluntarily deciding to go on the bomb, so you're treating yourself as a person as well. You volunteered to do this, so you could at least you're allowed to do it. I don't know that it demands that you do it, but it's interesting. From a utilitarian point of view, if you know that you can save everyone else's life and no one else is in a similar position, or you know that no one else will do it, then utilitarian demands that you do it. Utilitarianism demands that you do it, that you sacrifice yourself if you know others won't do it.
And then you've saved all of us here.
Can you sacrifice someone else?
No, you can't.
Well, actually, I think that it's possible you could
That you can
justify.
make that.
Yeah, I think from a utilitarian
I've
point
heard,
of view.
Yep, I've
Yeah.
heard those. Yeah.
Yeah, you could justify sacrificing someone else. In fact, people use utilitarian reasoning during war often. They say, well, we can kill. We're either going to have all of this whole battalion die, or we can just take out a couple of people and the battalion
Yeah.
won't die. And that sounds like utilitarian reasoning.
Yeah, there's this horrible case study about it's back in the wild west, and some homesteaders and a woman and her husband have set up a home. She has 2 children. One's a brand new baby, the other's still a toddler, and her husband has to go away for the winter to work, and she's going to be there at the homestead. And they don't expect visitors either. And the first big snowfall comes, she's out at a well, and she is bitten by a rattlesnake. And she tries as hard as she can to get all the venom out and do what she can, but as it gets closer and closer, she can clearly tell that she's going to die, and she leaves the message saying, I just couldn't let my children starve to death and die. I had to kill all of us. And so she kills all of them with a gun, and they find the bodies in the spring. So it's, here is a sacrifice, but she's making, it's an ethical problem. Of course, it's a huge ethical problem, but she's making the sacrifice because she's hoping they won't suffer as much.
Yeah, she reasoned in a utilitarian way. That was the right thing to do from a utilitarian point of view.
Yeah, but it's a tough case,
Yes,
isn't
it is. It is tough. It would be tough to actually do a lot of what utilitarianism demands.
Yeah, it would, wouldn't it?
Yes, it's a very demanding ethical theory.
Yeah. Well, let's pull up the next graphic and see if it helps us soften this just a little bit. And would you read that for us, John?
Yes. Disinterested spectator. Utilitarianism requires impartialness, like that of a disinterested spectator. The assailants of utilitarianism seldom have the justice to acknowledge that the happiness which forms the utilitarian standard of what is right in conduct is not the agent's own happiness, but that of all concerned. As between his own happiness and that of others, utilitarianism requires him to be as strictly impartial as a disinterested and benevolent spectator.
So a disinterested and benevolent spectator, and it's a hard thing. Cassie?
I think this sounds really funny to me because, well, utilitarianism, unlike some of the other philosophies we studied, seems a lot more, it recognizes emotion a lot more because it's looking at the end happiness and the greater happiness. But this seems kind of like you have to have a lack of emotion, and there is some calculated impartialness and things like that.
And sometimes there has to be, like let's say with a paramedic who comes upon an accident, and you can see that this car is under a semi, it's getting ready to explode, and you wonder, do I get in there and try to save this person who's still screaming? This is an actual case. Or do I save my own life? And certainly the paramedics are trained to say, you save your own life because you're just causing another problem. You're just making this worse. The tough thing that happened in this particular case was when the paramedics decided that they couldn't go in there and save that person because it was too close to blowing up. There was a California paramedic who stopped, saved the person with 15 seconds to spare or something, and it was on the news and kind of made these other paramedics look like they hadn't done the self-sacrifice like they should have, but they'd been taught also to be thinkers, to be disinterested spectators, and that there was a point where you can't do this self-sacrifice as much as you would like.
Wouldn't a consequence of this type of thinking be that if I'm faced with a situation where I have a choice between 5 people that I don't know dying or 2 of my family members dying, that to be impartial, I've got to decide that those 5 people survive rather than my 2 family members? Isn't that a kind of a consequence of this type of thinking?
I'll let Dennis take that one because I know that I'm going to go for my own happiness and save my own family. But right here we are asked, Mill tells us we must be a disinterested spectator.
I mean, one of the criticisms that people make of utilitarianism is that you can't, in essence, ethically, from an ethical standpoint, it destroys your relationships with the people who are closest to you because you would have to You'd have to sacrifice them in some sense, and not. I mean, that the sense or the case that you gave is an extreme case, but just think about it in everyday life. Should I let my daughter take karate lessons, or should I use that $35 a month to give it to a charity to help people who are starving in Africa? It seems like utilitarianism demands that I do the latter and not the former, which means that except for basic needs, I basically can't do very much for myself and for my family. And in fact, I think this is one of the things that arises out of this idea that we should be entirely disinterested spectators, because we're disinterested in ourselves, we're disinterested in our family members, except for as they fit into the overall calculus. If that's the case, and if everyone's living according to utilitarianism, it looks almost as if we're all going to be more unhappy. Is it a self-defeating theory? If we act according to the theory, are we all going to be more unhappy because we're not worrying about ourselves, and we're trying to worry about other people, and so we're all unhappy not worrying about ourselves? That's an interesting question.
Well, it is, and where Mill's going to take us is okay, let's go back and focus on education again, and focus on ourselves and our learning and having a well-educated society. So it's a very thorny concept, and he kind of leaves it there for us to figure out. Kind of leaves a little car wreck inside you, doesn't it? Any other thoughts on this? Well, let's go ahead and bring the next one up. And Cassie, would you read that for us, please?
Yeah. The Golden Rule. In the Golden Rule of Jesus of Nazareth, we read the complete spirit of the ethics of utility. To do as you would be done by, and to love your neighbor as yourself, constitute the ideal perfection of morality.
Okay, thank you, Cassie. And how would you say that fits in with the discussion that we've just had on useless self-sacrifice and on doing those things as a benevolent spectator?
Well, I think as far as useless sacrifice goes, you wouldn't want someone else to uselessly sacrifice themselves if it weren't necessary. So, yeah, you wouldn't want that on yourself, so you wouldn't want someone else to do it.
Lloyd, why would Mill bring up Jesus of Nazareth at this point in the reading? Why does he want to make this comparison?
I think there's a couple reasons that he's doing it. I think probably the biggest reason, or at least what he's trying to pull out, is he says it's the complete spirit of the ethics of utility. So he's trying to say is like, look, this is what the spirit has done, and it's the spirit of trying to help other people out and to try to create happiness. Just like the Golden Rule says, like, you want to be happy? Well, of course you want to be happy, so let's help everyone else be happy as well. And I think maybe another reason he is doing it is because a lot of these philosophers were criticized of being anti-religious and whatnot, and so he's bringing that aspect back in, in some sense probably to defend himself from those kind of accusations as well.
Okay, thanks. In fact, this is something that John brought up before, Dennis, that quite often our philosophers are invoking the Golden Rule in some way or another in their writings. Why do you think that Mill is doing this?
Well, I think that the way in which that it's similar to the Golden Rule is that it involves a significant amount of altruism. Mm-hmm. Being utilitarian requires that you be altruistic and that you not just worry about your own interests, that you worry about the interests of others as well, and that you put yourself in their place, sort of, and you try to think, okay, well, how would other people feel about this action? And that's sort of what you're supposed to do with the Golden Rule, is you're supposed to put yourself in someone else's place and figure out how they would feel about this action and act accordingly.
Okay, thank you. Also, sometimes I'll have students feel very guilty when we're talking about the useless self-sacrifice. And they'll say, but as a good Samaritan, I should do whatever I can to save someone else's life. And I think that Mill is also saying this fits in with Jesus Christ as well. You really don't need to give up your life. It's all right for you to think this through and look at the long-term consequences. And your death is probably not a good long-term consequence. Okay, well, let's move on to the next one. And this is going to be talking more about happiness. And would you read this for us, John?
Yes. Happiness for the individual, good for the whole. As a means of making the nearest approach to this ideal, utility would enjoin, first, that laws and social arrangements should place the happiness or the interest of every individual as nearly as possible in harmony with the interest of the whole.
And let's have you read the next one as well.
And secondly, that education and opinion which have so vast a power over human character, should so use that power as to establish in the mind of every individual an indissoluble association between his own happiness and the good of the whole.
Okay, so Dennis, how do you think we'd go about doing that?
Well, I think, I mean, one of the main points that he makes here is education. I think that he ties in his ethical theory to a view about the purpose of education that is in certain ways kind of a new or more radical view about education than would have been advocated prior to his time. That is that everyone ought to be educated, because in a democracy, everyone ought to be involved in the decision-making process, and to do that you need to be informed, you need to know what's going on, so you need to be educated. And then he adds in that it sounds almost as if he wants utilitarianism to be taught as the ethical orthodoxy in this education. And to some extent, in some places, it kind of is. I mean, when you take public policy classes, it sounds like you're just reasoning in utilitarian ways.
It does. John?
Was John Stuart Mill influential on public schooling, on it becoming kind of the norm, especially here in the United States, that we are all educated from a young age, and we all are kind of, we have a right to 12 years of education usually?
You know, I think that Mill is very foundational in a lot of things that continue on. But for Mill also, that was so important, he was fighting for women to have the right to vote. And that would also be fighting for women to be in college, to be able to have, you know, more than just a very short educational span. And so we see him as a suffragette, so to speak. I mean, really wanting to advance education for women and advance women's roles in society. So I know you didn't particularly ask me a question about feminism there, but I think there are many places where you can see fallout or even direct attribution to Mill and some of our educational philosophers and what they think would bring about the greatest happiness for society. Any thoughts on that?
John Dewey, who was one of the major advocates of public education and the universalization of public education in the United States, does trace a lot of his philosophical positions back to people like John Stuart Mill, and so there's probably some influence there. And I imagine that John Stuart Mill's generation had a heavy influence on public education in Britain as well. Cassie had a point also.
Yeah, I was just going to, when you're talking about him being a suffragette, did his philosophy on women, was that established before he was married to, what was her
Harriet Taylor.
Harriet Taylor, or was that after the fact, or was she an influence in that? Do you know?
I think that the two of them collaborated a lot during their lifetimes, and that even though they weren't married at the time, that there was a lot of collaboration. I think she was a very good influence on John Stuart Mill.
The Subjugation of Women, that was written by both of them?
Well, it's got his name on it, and it probably might not have sold with her name on it.
Right.
But in looking at other writings of his, I don't know if you'll agree with me on this, I think it definitely shows a different voice in it. That I think it definitely shows both of their influence in the writing. And
it would be ironic, though, if it's a feminist text and she helped write it and her name's not on it.
Right.
Yeah.
But I don't know whether that's
or if it would have been allowable to have her name on it. I don't know. There were such strange things going on in philosophy at that time, so you don't see very many women philosophers who are accepted during that time. But at least he did. He accepted a woman philosopher and did work with her.
Yeah, and you have to remember also that John Stuart Mill was raised in a very liberal sort of environment. Right. It wasn't very, from what I understand, his parents weren't particularly religious, and they were definitely not conservative. I mean, to be friends with Jeremy Bentham meant that they were sort of more in the radical sections of society. You know, they were kind of free thinkers, very open-minded, and so I imagine they already probably had some sense that women should play an equal role in society.
Okay. Any other thoughts? John, did you have a question?
No, but I do have a comment. I mean, it would make sense that John Stuart Mill would be an early suffragette because he is talking about education. He does kind of have this idea of equality among people. to a certain extent. And I mean, if he thinks that education can improve our lives, and it same goes for women, and they should be in school too for longer periods of time anyway, and in college and so on.
Okay.
So.
In fact, we'll move on into some of those quotes, but first we've got a quote on utilitarianism and religion. And Kisper, would you read that one for us?
We not uncommonly hear the doctrine of utility inveighed against as a godless doctrine. If it be necessary to say anything at all against so mere an assumption, we may say that the question depends upon what ideas we have formed of the moral character of deity.
And continue on, please.
If it be a true belief that God desires above all things the happiness of his creatures, and that this is his purpose in their creation, utility is not only not a godless doctrine, but more profoundly religious than any other.
So, Lloyd, how do you think he can make this claim that utility is not only not a godless doctrine, but perhaps more profoundly religious than any other?
Well, he says right there, it says, if it's a true belief that God desires the happiness of his creatures. And that's, and he's saying, well, if that's the case, then that's what utilitarianism is seeking for, the happiness of all, as much as humanity as possible. And so he's saying that's the same thing. So it's not irreligious. He said it's profoundly religious because it's trying to put in effect the very things that people are claiming God wants.
Okay. And in our last class period, we were talking about Kant and that happiness wasn't the goal. But in our reading of Mill, happiness is the goal. And he definitely thinks that God would want happiness for human beings, that our lives should be ones of happiness. Cassie?
I just was remembering like the first time I encountered utilitarianism, and I was like, well, how does that, how would that work with religion? Because with Christianity, specifically because, when you have different situations where you are sacrificing human life for a greater good or things like that are a little, I don't know, sticky situations. But like you guys were saying, it's if it's our greatest happiness that's being addressed, then that's definitely Christian theory and ideology.
Yeah, good point. And I liked your point before about Jeremy Bentham being radical and probably seen as perhaps irreligious. And do you think this could be a criticism that's being weighed against utilitarianism as well?
Oh yeah, I think people were saying that about it, and because they knew that the main advocates of it weren't particularly religious. John Stuart Mill did write some things about religion. He has 3 essays that he wrote about theism, one in particular where he deals with the problem of evil and says, well, if there is a God, God's got to be finite. God couldn't be omnipotent. So he did write about religion. It's not clear what his actual religious beliefs were. My guess is that he was probably somewhat agnostic. He was, so to some extent, this is polemical. To some extent, what he's trying to do is persuade those who would reject it because it's coming from people who have more of a secular background. And he's trying to persuade them, hey, don't reject it outright. Don't have such a strong bias against it just because it's advocated by people who are agnostic. Because it could fit with a religious perspective. You could be a utilitarian and a Christian. There's nothing inconsistent about the two.
Okay, very good. And any other questions or comments? Okay, well, John, let's have you read about the capacity for nobler feelings.
Capacity for the nobler feelings is in most natures a very tender plant, easily killed, not only by hostile influences, but by mere want of sustenance. And in the majority of young persons, it speedily dies away if the occupations to which their position in life has devoted them, and the society into which it has thrown them, are not favorable to keeping the higher capacity in exercise.
Oh, Kisper, this is one of my favorite quotes. I just think that it's a lovely challenge for us. Tell me a little bit about your views on this quote.
Well, I think it's saying that throughout life, you go throughout life and so many things come up that it kind of kills your ability and your willingness for those nobler feelings. And I think he's saying that we should try and live in a way that we keep those nobler feelings even among life. Is that what it's saying, or am I wrong?
Well, I think you can even add to it. How would you add to it, John? How do you kill your nobler feelings?
Or they're just killed through experience and kind of what happens to you throughout life and the bad experiences you have. And it's almost like he's advocating kind of a childlike position. It's like we need to go back to the time when these experiences haven't affected us to such an extent that we're kind of alienated from these nobler feelings.
When you come home from your day of work and school, John, would you rather play video games or would you rather read?
Well, both. Or play with my son. There's that always, but yeah.
Okay. Anyone like to add to this, Cassie?
So is he saying that some activities are will help keep those nobler feelings more than others?
Absolutely.
Or like which activities is he suggesting,
well,
or what kind of behavior?
Yeah, there we're back to it. And I'd have to say that it's your educational aspirations. He's saying it may be hard to pick up that book. It may be more fun to head on down to the pub and lift a few with your friends, but instead he's hoping that you will continue your education, is how I've often.
So Mills isn't much of an escapist, I take it.
I don't think so. No, I think he's pretty dedicated to it. How about you, Dennis? How do you see it?
Well, given when he's writing this, I actually start to think of the opium epidemic in England, that he probably knows about that influence. And we know, I mean, it just seems like an empirical fact of the matter that there are certain substances that when people use them, they just seem to deaden their ability to appreciate other things. And I think that opium is one of those things, and he may very well have been thinking about the use of drugs, but he also mentions not just by hostile influences, but also by the mere want of sustenance. And I think that poverty itself, the suffering that comes from poverty, might make it very difficult to appreciate or to cultivate those nobler feelings, because after all, if you're practically starving, or if you're suffering from lack of medical care or shelter, you're not really going to worry about understanding the subtleties of Shakespearean criticism or something like that. Really, you just want food. You want your next meal, and that's what you're going to worry about. And so one of the basic things for utilitarianism to do would be to make sure that everyone has food, medical care, and shelter, so that way they can cultivate these nobler feelings.
Sure. And on a more practical level too, one way that I look at it would be those noble feelings that I have, those things that make me feel like I really am contributing well within society. How do I keep those nourished and not, just turn on the TV at night and kind of veg? You want to tell us a little bit more, Cassie?
Yeah, but to go along with that, did Mills see educational value only in like academic, those higher things, or is it possible that maybe from watching a movie you could get, I don't know, some sort of a different education and artistic, I don't know, view?
I know where you're going, where he's going to say, are there higher pleasures? And he says there are decidedly higher pleasures. And once again, as we've pointed out, he gets to make that scale. Now for you, it might be that you're studying film criticism, or theory that goes along with your literature and film. And so for you, this is still raising your intellectual bar.
So it does stay pretty academic, though, in
I
the way
believe
that he
it does.
sees it.
Mill would have liked independent film rather than Hollywood.
Right.
I think so. I think so too. Well, let's look at this next quote, because it continues on and it's lovely as well. And Lloyd, would you read this one for us?
Yeah. Men lose their high aspirations as they lose their intellectual tastes, because they have not time or opportunity for indulging them, and they addict themselves to inferior pleasures, not because they deliberately prefer them, but because they are either the only ones to which they have access, or the only ones which they are any longer capable of enjoying.
Okay, so John, any thoughts on that one? Does that tie in?
Well, I come home from a hard day of work, and instead of picking up that book, I play video games, which I think he would consider a lower pleasure than reading, obviously. And I think that's really what he's saying, is that you can lose your taste for the higher pleasures, and that I might always prefer the video game because of the hostile influence of the outside world. So
yeah. In fact, Kisper, let's have you read the next one and comment on how it ties in with this point.
If by happiness be meant a continuity of high pleasurable excitement, it is evident enough that this is impossible. A state of exalted pleasure lasts only moments, or in some cases, with some intermissions, hours or days, and is the occasional brilliant flash of enjoyment. not its permanent and steady flame.
I just love that quote too. So how does this tie in with the comment that you were about to make as well?
Well, what I was going to say earlier is that people don't necessarily prefer to lose those higher and nobler feelings. Like they don't necessarily want to play the video games or do the lower pleasures, but they're in a way forced to because of our society or because of having to work and not having the time to do things. But so I hadn't really thought about the second quote.
Yeah, where he just talks about, hey, we're not always going to be having these exalted pleasures. We'll have a bright flash or a bright flame, but you know, a lot of life is mundane. And in fact, Dennis, would you read the very last graphic for us? I think it's such a lovely one, and tell us a little bit about it.
Is it what happiness is? Is that?
Uh-huh.
The happiness which they meant was not a life of rapture, but moments of such, in an existence made up of few and transitory pains, many and various pleasures, with a decided predominance of the active over the passive, and having as the foundation of the whole, not to expect more from life than it is capable of bestowing.
So now we have a concluding definition of happiness, and you just have like 30 seconds to tell us about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, overall, you're going to have more times where you have those flashes of happiness, those flashes where you're just enjoying life, enjoying the world, and less times where you're in intense pain. But it's going to be over the whole of your life, and it's not going to be something that continues constantly.
Great. So Mill does not want us to think that life is going to be just one brilliant flash of happiness, of rapture, of great excitement going on. But we'll have some of it, and it'll be wonderful. And we should look for those things that bring us happiness. Thank you, Dennis. You've been great.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate you being with us. Thank you to you students. And we'll be moving on to Carol Gilligan. Thanks.